Hi, welcome back to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm your host, Mark Grabe, and we are joined today by Jacob Stoller. He's a returning guest. He was here with us episode 221. That was back, 9 years ago. It was 2015. But Jacob is author of a new book just released called Productivity Reimagined, Shattering Performance Myths to Achieve Sustainable Growth. So Jacob is a journalist, speaker, facilitator. He's a Shingo-Prize-winning author of a previous book, The Lean CEO, and that was the topic of that last episode. You can find it scrolling or searching in your podcast app, or go to leanblog.org/221. Jacob has published hundreds of articles on technology and business management methods. He's known for demystifying complex topics for general business audiences. He's delivered a variety of keynote speeches and learning events and workshops in Canada, Europe, and the US. He's done a lot of work for clients, including Microsoft, Dell Computer, Staples, and more. So, Jacob, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
I'm fine, Mark, and thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. We've done the podcast, and then there was also a webinar that you did for us in the KaiNexus webinar series. I remember that well, and KaiNexus is still growing and going well beyond the webinar series. That continues. That's not our core business, of course. But I'm glad you're back. Here on the podcast. We'll be talking about the new book. Congratulations on the release. And
Thank you.
I noticed first that the book was endorsed by a lot of people, including people who have been guests either here on this podcast or My Favorite Mistake. So that includes John Shook, Michael Ballet, Carrie Siggins, who I recently had on My Favorite Mistake, and then Rich Sheridan, CEO of Menlo Innovations, he's done both podcasts over the years. So a lot of good endorsements, right?
Okay.
Jacob, how would you give what would you say in terms of an update? What have you been up to since the book, The Lean CEO?
Well, I have kept writing. I kept talking to people. And as you remember, The Lean CEO was really a study to determine what is the sort of senior management perspective on lean. What do they do in the boardroom? What do the CEOs have to say to shareholders, the press, et cetera, et cetera? So I looked at that, and conclusion was that there was no single playbook for CEOs on the lean side. There were many, many different ways they had of going about it. And so I realized that there's more to be learned here. And through my writing, I started to discover a lot of people that displayed what I would call lean-like thinking. And these are people writing about, doing technology, people doing anti-poverty initiatives, people doing sustainability projects. And they showed me a lot of thinking in their work, which reminded me a lot like lean. So I started to dig a little deeper into that. And I found that the real common ground that people shared is really productivity. In other words, for all these people are trying to do more with the resources they have.
Yeah. And so we'll have a chance to dig into all of that. I'm curious with the book The Lean CEO, as you continue talking with people and engaging with the lean community, if you were to do a new edition, are there things you've learned from other lean CEOs? Do you feel like it holds up pretty well to somebody reading it today?
Yeah, I'm saddened by the fact that some of the stories, case studies in the Lean CEO kind of fell off the wagon, if you will.
Oh.
So that's very disappointing, and won't go into that too much. But
sure,
I think I'm very interested in, if I were to do a new edition of that, I would dig even deeper into the people side of it, because I keep learning more and more about the importance of people and the importance of culture. So yeah, I think there definitely some of the stuff in my research would have been good material to add to the Lean CEO.
No, I understand. We won't spend too much time on it. I understand how you feel. I've felt the same way about all three editions of my Lean Hospitals book.
Really? Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
good, executive changes and other, it's usually executive changes. It's not that Lean stops working. It's just somebody else comes in who doesn't share some of the same mindsets.
Exactly. Yeah.
But with, the new book, Productivity Reimagined, I mean, productivity is a word I think we all are familiar with, and we throw it around. There might be different definitions in different people's heads, though. So I'm curious, first off, how do you define productivity?
Okay. Well, yeah, there are different definitions, but there really shouldn't be, and I'll explain why. But productivity is, as they define it, and it's whether the Bureau of Labor Statistics or whatever you're looking at, they say productivity is equal to output over inputs. And productivity growth is what we really want. We want to get more output with the same inputs, because productivity itself doesn't have any real meaning as a figure, right? Because productivity has got quality mixed in with it, right?
Sure.
If you grow, if you make more ballpoint pens and the quality goes, then you haven't really improved anything, right? So it's really important to keep the quality picture in mind. So I would say productivity growth is really an increase in value with the same or less resources. So I think it's really important to keep that in perspective, because, we get a lot of reporting about productivity and say, well, okay, we're going to have to sacrifice quality for productivity or something like that. And that's not really productivity improvement at all.
Right.
So, yeah, I think if we stick really strictly to that, it becomes, actually improving output with the resources you have is really the driver of, I guess, what I'd call regenerative economy. It's the way that we make things better. And I'm going to actually give you a really interesting quote, Mark, because the IMF, International Monetary Fund, has a monthly magazine called Finance and Development. In the September issue is devoted entirely to productivity. And here's what the editor said. She said this really well. She said, productivity is a foundation of prosperity. The only way a country can raise its standard of living sustainably is to produce more with existing or fewer resources. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And then she goes on. Now, here's the interesting part, Mark. She goes on to say everything else about productivity is surprisingly complex. It is difficult to explain, difficult to measure, and as the past couple of decades show, difficult to improve. Now, interesting part about it is if I wanted to find a group of people that knew how to grow productivity, I would come running to the Lean community, because here we've got a community that's been practicing this for decades, right? And yet, when you look at, and the IMF has it's a wonderful survey of the problems with productivity. It looks at a lot of the macro issues, business dynamism, things like that. It looks how concentration, industry concentration, when you have big companies that don't have a lot of competition, they spend their resources defending their turf rather than growing productivity. All these things are really well stated, but nowhere do they talk about operational excellence, reducing waste, or any of that. So it's almost like we got a wide open stage here.
Yeah, because I think of a local level, in a factory. When I started my job at General Motors, there was one of the key measures was it was measured the other way. It was hours per engine, but you flip that. They were measuring inputs over outputs, but the key, still they were trying to improve productivity. They were producing really measurably poor quality. So it really should have been a measure of like hours per good engine. To feed quality into it. But I was going to ask you, I'm glad you brought up. There's a local thing that's easy to measure, counting the number of things you've made and counting the number of hours people worked. But then I was going to ask about, standard of living. And there's that societal impact that I'm sure people, if they view that as strictly a financial measure, it's built on operational measures, I think is part of what you're saying too, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, if we look at standard of living, the economists like to talk about dollars, but it's really what determines standard of living is the quality and the availability of the
Hmm.
services and products that we need to survive.
Yeah.
So, do we have uh, nutritional food, healthy foods available? Do we have shelter for people? Do we have good transportation? Do we have, entertainment? All these things have to be available to people.
Hmm.
And if we don't have it more readily available, people are going to be, they're not going to feel good about the economy.
Right.
And, a lot of the economic growth we've seen is not reflective of a better standard of living. And it
Mm.
doesn't actually factor into uh, better, cheaper, faster goods and services for people. So
Hmm.
absolutely, it all depends on operations.
Mm. And I mean, we think back. I mean, I'm going to look at it through a U.S. lens. I know
Sure,
you're in
I
Canada.
will too. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you've probably talked to executives in other countries, but I mean, I remember, I mean, growing up, auto industry challenges in Michigan in the 80s, going into the
Mm-hmm.
90s when I was going into grad school and,
Mm-hmm.
studying manufacturing management. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason for being was, this is mainly framed as a productivity gap. There was also a quality
Mm-hmm.
gap. And there
Yeah.
were so many, I mean, I think there was a lot of poor causal analysis at the time that blamed, American workers are lazy and that's why our productivity stinks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, NUMI, among other examples, really, I think, really disproved that. The problem is it's
Yeah,
not,
for sure.
who has better workers, it's about systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thoughts on
Yeah. No, that it certainly. Yeah, the Numi was an eye opener for a lot of people.
that? But I
But I
think,
think, sorry,
oh, go ahead.
go
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah. But I think what happens in large companies is um, you have a sort of a style of management which uh, tends to aggregate a lot of things, mostly in dollars.
Hmm.
And you've got people at the top management sort of running things on the assumption that the financials tell them everything they need to
Hmm.
know about the operation. So I think
Yeah.
that was probably a big factor at GM. Maybe you can uh, either confirm or deny that.
Well, maybe we can check. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, as you cover in the book, are productivity myths. I'm curious how many of those I experienced or
Sure.
heard, from leaders at that GM plant. But one other play on words that came to me. You said these leaders, maybe from a distance, they're not a lean
Mm-hmm.
leader. They're just staying in their office and looking at financial reports. You said they're aggregating a lot of things. That also aggravates a lot of
Yes,
people when
it
they
sure
don't have
does.
a
Yeah.
good understanding of what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think aggregated numbers, I mean, right off the top, they don't tell you what you need to improve, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at your total output for, a large sort of group of products or whatever, you know absolutely nothing about how to improve your productivity. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, but the aggregation I think mostly happens in the financial area, but it's based. I think there's the kind of another myth behind that, which I call the myth of segmented success, and that's that the productive resources of a company can be organized as a collection of independent components, and the
Mm-hmm.
whole equals the sum of the parts. So you can take all these departments and you could say, we're going to give you all KPIs
Mm-hmm.
to follow, and then we'll roll them all up. And we know that everybody satisfies their obligations under those KPIs, the company's going to perform well. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's a big myth. It's not
Right.
true. And we know that in the lean world, and that's one of the things that Deming. And by the way, my book,
Right.
I talk a lot about Deming because he was very, very articulate
Yeah.
in describing, what he calls the pyramid, which is this org chart shaped organizational structure. And it makes that assumption that you can just break anything down independently. And
Yeah.
he dedicated his last book to people who live under the tyranny of this prevailing style of management. So he
Yes.
was
As
railing against it.
as he called it. Well, and I think he also used language something like, we built this prison. We can also tear it down. I'm paraphrasing,
Yes.
but I remember you used like the image of this prison that we've built around ourselves.
Yeah, and that's we built is really really important, because I think people assume that it's some kind of natural law,
Mm-hmm.
that somebody reports to somebody, and that mechanical sort of picture is the way the world works. This is science,
Yeah.
and people start believing that when they're kids.
Yeah.
One of the stories in the book was that you talked about Red Sheridan. Well, he told
Mm-hmm.
me a story where his granddaughter came to visit the office, and uh, she comes to and says, "Pop, where do you sit?" And he takes her to his desk and says, "Here's my desk, and here's my computer." And she says, "Where's your name? You should have your name somewhere." And the idea was that she expected him to be in some corner office, and he said he felt a little embarrassed. What kind of CEO am I when I don't have a fancy corner office?
She was
Um,
expecting status symbols at even such a young
yeah.
age.
And he said she's
Wow.
only 8 years
Wow.
old. So, you put her, give her another 30 years and she's got her MBA. And
Mm-hmm.
then, imagine how entrenched those ideas are going to be.
Mm-hmm. And they're in the category of, well, it's not even we've always done it this way. It's more of like we've done it this way for a very long time, and these things get reinforced and passed along whether they work or not.
They do. And I learned that in school too. It made perfect sense when I came to this company that we were doing things that way. I mean,
Yeah.
it's these myths die very, very hard.
Mm-hmm. What's another myth that you've identified or hope that we could knock out?
Well, I'm very interested in the financial side, of course. The myth of the bottom line, and the fact, the myth being that the bottom line tells you everything you need to know
Mm-hmm.
about operations. I'm not saying that it's not useful, but I think we expect way too much about it. And I spent a lot of time actually when I was writing this book talking with Ori Fume, who's a wonderful teacher, and
Mm-hmm.
what I hadn't known at the time was that Ori uh, started looking at productivity way back 9 years before Art Byrne came to Wiremold. He was interested in the how to, he read a paper by the American Productivity Institute as part of when he was doing his master's. He read this paper, and it talked about separating productivity from price recovery. And the idea is you take time point A and time point B and you compare. They're really two components to profitability. One of them is productivity, which we've talked about. Then the other
Mm-hmm.
is any changes over those time periods in materials costs, labor costs, facilities costs, whatever those might be. And the point that Ori stresses is productivity is for many companies the only one you can actually control. So you should be working
Mm-hmm.
diligently on productivity. Whereas people often conflate that and they talk about their profitability and stuff like that, but they don't look at separating those two out. And he had to work very hard to do that,
Mm-hmm.
to make that separation. So that's a
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah.
The other piece of it, as we see with what's called lean accounting.
Mm-hmm.
Or he doesn't like that term because what he's doing is I'm just giving you the real numbers. It doesn't have to be
Right.
lean. Let's just talk about what the real costs are here. But
Yeah.
it's that many of the metrics that determine productivity and determine your success are non-financial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you
Mm-hmm.
have this black box, which is called operations. And I've been told that a lot of corporations, they just say that black box is, we don't understand that. It's a different language. We'll just leave that to operations and they can solve it. But that's often where all the leading indicators are for your
Mm-hmm.
company and being able to deliver value. So I
Yeah.
think it's this language gap between financial logic, which sees everything as a cost, right? They'll say,
Yeah.
okay, you want better quality, we'll invest in that. Okay, you want to get better delivery, we invest in that. But within that magic box, you have of process, you have what Deming called or what is called the Deming chain reaction. Whereas, okay, we
Right.
invest in quality, actually, our costs go down. And
Yeah.
furthermore, if we make the environment safer, that's also going to improve the operations and
Hmm.
save us money in the long run. So this
Hmm.
kind of logic doesn't make sense to accountants. They just see a bunch of costs, and you tell them, okay, well, let's invest in quality, and that'll lower our costs. So I think some of them might tell you you're crazy.
Or there's a myth. I ran across this in business school, and some of my
Mhm.
classmates who had industry experience
Yeah.
really challenged an economics professor to the point where he basically had to say, okay, look, I mean, he was a little nicer about it, but he was like, okay, yeah, shut up. Well, I need to get through the rest of the course. And we ended up scheduling time to talk to him later. But he was teaching this notion of optimal quality, which is
Okay.
looking again at this inherent trade-off.
Hmm.
Well, at some point, better quality isn't worth the cost, and we're like, but no, like, not to use the slogan of the
Yeah.
Crosby book, but quality can be free. Quality can improve. Like,
Hmm.
I don't, this idea of like we should accept a certain number of defects because it's optimal. Like that seems
Hmm.
so outdated, and that's what somebody was
Yeah.
teaching us at MIT in the late '90s. So
Yeah.
that's
No,
a
I know we're
frustrating
full.
myth.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are all these ideas that these false equivalencies that we set up as a strategy. And, it's interesting. Someone pointed out to me that in marketing, that might make sense, right? You might decide that we're going to market ourselves and attract customers who want low price, or we want to attract customers that want to pay more. But
Yeah,
that shouldn't dictate how you run your operations.
yeah. And I have seen it demonstrated in the real world enough to know it's not just a theory of this Deming
Mm-hmm.
chain reaction. But
Mm-hmm.
how often have we also seen then? I mean, there are so many things you could try to do to cut costs that end up
Mm-hmm.
hurting quality. But
Absolutely.
quality
Yeah.
improvement is only going to reduce costs.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, I know there's a lot of, and also I think this gets kind of blended with short-termism that's so
Mm-hmm.
prevalent now in large corporations. Where people are not
Well,
looking 3 or 4 quarters ahead, let alone
no.
3 or 4 years, right?
Yeah. Well, again, that's a decades old problem because Deming railed against it. And point one
Hmm.
of the Toyota Way from Jeff Liker's book is about long-term decision making. And a lot of
Exactly. Yeah.
people, more people are rushing to adopt 5S than they are rushing to adopt long-term thinking.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, it's a
So
nice
now
checkbox item, 5S.
a nice, you said
Checkbox
check box.
item, yeah.
Yeah.
It makes
Yeah.
nice photos, nice photo ops.
Yeah. We did lean. So yeah.
Yeah, we did lean, right.
We did that. So, I mean, I'd love to hear a little more about your process of interviewing over 60 leaders. I'd love to hear some of the breakdowns of like what levels, what industries, how consistent were the things they were saying, or were there contradictions? Back to your point earlier about there's no one way to
Um,
improve productivity.
Yeah, I tried to get a sort of a a cross mixture, and some manufacturers, some people like Rich Sheridan, some in healthcare, government. So I tried to cover it kind of broadly, but it this was interesting, very interesting. Mark, the interview process was a lot more difficult than I expected
Hmm.
because I did go talk to people that were really good at this, and a lot of them when I asked them about the myths that they confront and the barriers, a lot of them had to really think about it. It wasn't
Mhm.
obvious to them what the problems with conventional management are, just because they had kind of gotten past that or been able to do it. So
Yeah.
it took quite a while for these 5 myths to gel. That was a challenge.
But
But
I mean, a lot of these myths just kind of hang out in the back of people's minds, though, right? They
mhm.
might not be explicitly stated mindsets, but they're there.
Yeah, I think it might be that, but it was hard to get people to really articulate their answers on that. I had to do more digging, more probing, and stuff like that. But it was worth it because I think what we
Mhm.
did is we kind of discovered. I think we kind of learned together in these interviews. Kind of discovered what the real issues are. But one thing I want to add, Mark, to the whole
Mhm.
interview process is I talked to lots of non-lean folks that aren't directly in the lean community. First of all, folks that don't consider themselves lean organizations, but work with Deming principles.
Mhm.
And they've done some phenomenally good work in the book. I've also talked with people, one is an environmental engineer who does sustainability projects, and he does amazing things, which I would call lean thinking on a big
Hmm.
scale. I mean, he's going after food waste, for example. And statistic he gave me on food waste is that if food waste, if the carbon footprint of the wasted food in the world were a nation, it would be the nation with the third largest carbon footprint in the world, next to US and China.
Hmm.
It's an astonishing amount of waste in there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's all about eliminating waste, which a lot of environmental projects don't do. You know, what they do is they say, let's put in a solar panel. Let's put in solar panels or something like that. It's a lot of it is about kind of sort of nice announceable projects that are very
Hmm.
visible. But,
Yeah.
going into their factory and reducing waste may be by far the best way they can improve their environmental footprint, which is what this
Yeah.
company, Enviro Stewards, is dedicated to. But
Hmm.
it's often hard to get people's attention on that.
Yeah.
So that was a fascinating investigation.
Hmm. So that sounds like that's in the category of what you call the like lean thinking. They may not be
Yeah,
using that label, but you recognize it.
lean like thinking. And I'd give you a quick example if you want, Mark.
Yeah.
I know you're an engineer, so um, you'll like this story. That Bruce Taylor, this is the engineer, was called into a company that a factory that made solvents and chemical factory, and they wanted to reduce their. They had a huge exhaust fan that was blowing away the fumes, toxic fumes, and they wanted to reduce the energy consumption of this enormous fan. So the way Bruce explains it, he said, "Well, I could have looked at it as an electrical engineer, and I could have gotten them a motor, a more energy efficient motor, and that would have
Hmm.
saved maybe 5-10%. I don't know. Or if I'd looked at it as from a heating standpoint, here we are. We're in Canada, right, and we're blowing hot air out into the winter.
Yeah.
If I installed an air-to-air heat exchanger, I could save close to 50% energy. Way better results just by looking at the different discipline." He
Yeah.
said, "But as a chemical engineer," he said, "I went in there and I looked. I said, where are the fumes coming from? Turns out they were coming from one vat. So what did they do? They sealed the vat. They condensed the fumes into solvent, wound up selling that solvent and making
Mm.
money on it, and got rid of the exhaust fan
Wow.
completely." But these silos, the
Yeah.
reason Bruce tells his story is these silos are typical. Companies, they put out RFPs to do an electrical study to how to reduce their electrical energy, and nobody looks at the heat, right? It's
Yeah.
all siloed. And government projects do it, and large
Mm.
companies do it, and it's so the way we're looking at the environment often, like I say, that's very unlean approach.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of lean, what are some misconceptions or myths that you uncovered in this discussion? When companies are trying to improve productivity using
Mm.
lean methodologies, are there pitfalls or misconceptions?
I think the people first part is really, really
Mm.
underestimated, and I'll refer, because the Shingo Institute found this out the hard way, because they found that people had won Shingo-Prize winners in factories in 2008. They were looking back and they realized that a lot of these had fallen off the ladder. The people who had won the
Right.
prize were not
Mhm.
sustaining that excellence. So they went and they revamped, did an incredibly detailed study and revamped the Shingo principles
Right.
to be very, very much around people. And it's really a wonderful thing what they did.
Hmm.
So that's, I think, the people first thing is something we really, really got to push. I know people have talked about that a lot, but boy, you really need to do it. And in the last chapter of the book, I uh, presented a sort of a kind of a step by step that I would advocate based on what I saw, but a lot of the things that you have to do even before you start teaching lean are things like building trust,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
and getting people working on the culture before you can actually start throwing tools at people and expecting them to make that improvement. So I think
Right.
people first is I would say that's very, very strong and very, very important.
Mhm. So when companies are, and I mean, I think they shouldn't call it lean unless they are trying to engage everybody in improvements and letting people participate in that process.
Mhm.
From your research, from your interviews, what would you say are the most effective strategies for having real engagement? And I'll preface, I hear people say things like, "We want people to feel like they were engaged." I'm like, well,
Mhm.
no, we need to actually engage them. What are some things you've learned about real engagement?
Well, gosh, leadership has to be really committed because you're changing the
Yeah.
role of your managers. And I think one of the problems there is something maybe we don't talk enough about. And we talk about what managers have to learn in terms of leadership skills, but there's an awful lot of unlearning. Again, we're talking about
Hmm.
things that people learned when they were 8 years old, and gosh, you went to school, you studied whatever your field is, engineering or psychology, whatever, and you're taught that this is going to teach you to manage, and you're going to be able to lead a group of people based on your knowledge. So telling them to throw their knowledge out the window, as they did, in some companies. I know there's some great stories at OC Tanner about that, where you have to say, we don't want your knowledge anymore. I know we've promoted you because of that, but
Uh-huh.
that's a big leap, right?
Right.
So I think, we shouldn't put people down for those beliefs that they had. They came by them legitimately. And I think there needs to be compassion for the unlearning process, which is very, very difficult.
Hmm. Hmm. Or empathy for it, because I mean,
Yeah.
and it's tough. I struggle with this
Hmm.
of trying not to be judgmental and remind myself,
Hmm.
even back to some people at GM, who I thought were just really lousy leaders and
Hmm.
ineffective in terms of their results, of
Hmm.
like, well, they've been doing things a certain way for decades. They
Yeah.
they can't just flip a switch,
Hmm.
and it's not like updating an operating system on a computer.
Hmm.
Unlearning is more probably more difficult than learning, and how to help someone
Hmm.
feel safe and unthreatened
Exactly. Yeah,
by a need to
exactly.
unlearn, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's tough. And I think, we teach leaders in lean to be compassionate and to listen to people and stuff like that. But, we have to apply that same thing to the manager that might be struggling with a change like this.
Yeah.
So it's
And recognizing they're part of a system too, back to Dr. Deming and his, prevailing system
yes.
of management
Hmm.
language and
Hmm.
his prison language.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's it's to be that I struggle with that one, and I appreciate
Right.
when people remind me sometimes with a push that, hey, these leaders are part of a system too.
Right. Right.
Um, so we talk about people first, but I
Hmm.
mean, companies, even like Toyota and OC Tanner and
Hmm.
others, use technology.
Hmm.
Toyota's got a certain view on technology, that technology
Hmm.
should support the people in the process.
Yeah.
A lot of people think technology alone is going to be a huge productivity
Hmm.
driver. I've seen that in healthcare. It's certainly
Sure.
viewed that way in manufacturing, or maybe people are viewing AI as something
Hmm.
that would be a productivity driver. I mean, what are some of the pitfalls or misconceptions when it comes to leveraging technologies in the name of productivity?
Well, I think with technology, we kind of, and that's one of the myths, by the way, that omnipotence of technology. But I think
Hmm.
that's kind of, in a way, it's very related to this idea of segmented success, because we tend to take a chunk of functionality in an organization, and we say, let's automate that, right? We got so many
Mm.
employees, well, let's reduce the number of employees in this. And some consulting firm will come along, and say, well, people in your industry have reduced such, by so many by introducing this kind of robotics or whatever, right? So that
Hmm.
these ideas that you can generically kind of throw technology on top of things. But, that's not panned out very well. I mean, the investments in technology over really since 2008 have not um, translated into productivity growth. They have been, it, well, they've increased productivity in terms of quality and output, but they have not been able to, as they often hope, to get rid of people. So I think what's evolving right now is a kind of technology which it's becoming more um, of a tool and less of a sort of a be all and end all.
Hmm.
For example,
Right.
the fastest growing area in robotics right now is what are called cobots, collaborative robots, and these work side by side with people. And it makes sense, because in the old days we were looking at mass production and really, really high volumes and really low mix. But now, you talk to the average manufacturer, they're saying, well, I had to have only 3 or 4 variations in my product. Now I have to have 200, right? So
Mm-hmm.
much lower volumes. You need a much more flexible, agile type environment. So that's why people are turning to this kind of flexible, cobots, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now you talk about AI. Yeah, there's some great things you can do with AI, and especially with what do they call Industry of Things, IoT. We have sensors all over the
The,
darn place. So
yeah.
so
The Internet of Things. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so you can do amazing things with that, right? Because you can look at how a process is moving in a lot of detail, and you can predict things. But again, these things have to be tempered with the need for, there's a lot of decision making out there.
Yeah.
And, the technology is getting much, much more user friendly now so that you can get people on the shop floor actually talking to the technology. So I think you've got to be asking the question, as Toyota did, how does the technology actually improve the process? Does it make it better? And while you're asking that question, let's see if we can do it without technology.
Yeah.
And one of the stories I tell in the book is actually Parker Hannifin, where they and that's certainly a very high tech company, right?
Hmm.
But they have a process where if you're going to propose a robot, you have to first justify it by seeing if it's possible to do it without it. Because technology
Right.
can be a pain, right? I mean, you have to maintain it. You have to do all the software upgrades.
Hmm.
Maybe it goes obsolete. There's all kinds of stuff that maybe be better if you didn't have to deal with. So you know, they told me a story at Parker Hannifin about how Stephen Moore, who's actually retired now, but what he told me is he just gives an example of a project he had just done where he had a robotics team that wanted to plan the implementation of a robot. They had a cell with 3 people. They wanted to reduce it to 2, and they had a safety problem that they wanted to solve as well. So I thought putting a
Yeah.
robot in would help do that. Well, they did a study on it, and they divided into 2 teams. One team worked on the robotic implementation. The other team worked on, let's see if we can improve the process without a robot.
Hmm.
And at the end of 1 week, the team improving the process had reduced the number of people needed from 3 to 2, and they'd solved the safety problem without a robot.
Yeah.
So I think that happens all the time in companies that really have it down, that really understand their processes. But you got to understand the process, and you have to have good, strong process thinking if you want to do automation in a productive way.
Right. Right. And I would hope then from a people standpoint that that third person, that the person who was no longer needed, hopefully got redeployed or
Oh,
retrained or
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll also add that when you do these studies and you do automate, you do a much better job of it.
Hmm.
You get much better at automation when you understand the process. But so
Right.
many people come from the outside because of departmental divisions
Yeah.
and say we can throw automation into this functional area here
Yeah.
and we'll get such and such
Yeah.
of an ROI. But it
Yeah.
hasn't been working.
Yeah. And I mean, there's just so many examples
Mm-hmm.
of automating the waste I just
Yes.
cringe when you see, like, first, a lot of the first work that I ever did in healthcare about 20 years ago was in hospital laboratories, which are very equipment driven, blood
Mm-hmm.
testing. And, most of that is, that tube of blood goes into machines, and those
Mm-hmm.
machines, and people hadn't had the education to understand, as an industrial engineer
Mm-hmm.
might, well, what should the
Yeah.
right layout be that would maximize the flow? And then you go into these
Yeah.
labs and you would see things like the highest volume instruments were in the far back corner away from the receiving area. And we're like, well, we could
Yeah.
rethink that. Like, let's put the high volume machines closer to where the specimens arrive. And in a lot of these laboratories, they had literally just put in really slow conveyor belts,
Mm-hmm.
slower than like a human walking those
Yeah.
tubes of blood back was wasteful, but spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to automate it and to slow it down. Like, there
Mm-hmm.
were huge productivity gains from tearing out the automation.
Yeah.
And,
And
I wish they had improved the process first, and they wouldn't have wasted the money to
yeah.
put it in and then take it out.
Yeah, your friend Joe Schwartz had a lot to say about this, and
Yeah.
one of the things is software. And they automate paper processes and things like that with software. But as Joe put it, you create these monuments, where the process isn't all that good, but it's going to be way harder for him to fix it if it's all been encoded in software than it would be if they
Mhm.
had just left it alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
So, who would you say are some of the success stories that you were maybe surprised to find out? Find OC Tanner, companies
Mm-hmm.
like that. Probably no surprise to someone in the lean community. Are there companies who are really a standout these days when it comes to productivity?
Yeah, I'm really inspired actually by some of the younger CEOs that I talk to because they talk a slightly different language. They don't maybe use as many of the lean terms as I saw,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
one of the CEOs, for example, talked about just the whole crisis that young people face in society about not having purpose in their work. I mean, and another CEO talking about just sort of how he doesn't feel. He had to get used to the fact that older people considered him um, kind of worried about what he thought because he had his title of the CEO. So, I think there's some younger people that are not thinking in the same rigid way
Mm-hmm.
that people of previous generations were. So I was inspired by that. I was inspired by the thinking of, it's one of my favorite stories. It's somebody that's working on anti-poverty initiatives. And, he's discovered that the real secret to sustainably getting people out of poverty is giving them agency to sort of start enterprises and businesses that get the rest of their community out of poverty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a an organization that's been really successful
Mm-hmm.
at making that happen. So that's very inspiring, because I think that the traditional sort of helping sector looks at putting services and social workers and stuff and hiring them to tell poor people what to do, how to get out of poverty. And
Mm-hmm.
this is a very different approach, which is
Yeah.
working very well. So inspired by that, again, a kind of
Yeah.
lean like thinking
Mm-hmm.
that's not in a lean organization. So inspired by
Yeah.
that, inspired by some of the Deming stories I saw, which was not something I included in the lean CEO. So
Yeah.
a lot of new stuff. And Carrie Siggins, who you interviewed on this show, very inspiring. She's very sensitive about people
Mm-hmm.
and ownership. She talks about the ownership mindset. It's an idea
Yes.
that fits very well with lean. And her first lean book
Mm-hmm.
was The Lean CEO of all books. So
Oh, good.
interesting too. So, but
Yeah. And I mean, and yeah, Carrie was a guest on My Favorite
mhm,
Mistake. I'll make a plug
mhm,
for that podcast series. I love talking to her because she was talking not just about mindset, but actual literal employee ownership, and
yes.
that how powerful that is to, and sometimes, you hear companies say, we want people to think like owners. Well, actually helping them be an owner probably helps with that.
Oh yeah, she totally gets that. And I just
Yeah,
very inspiring. Yeah.
yeah, very.
But again, it's new
Um,
territory for us in the lean world, right? And Rich
yeah,
Sheridan as well. Rich
hmm
Sheridan doesn't consider himself a dyed-in-the-wool lean guy. As a matter of fact, he loves Deming too, what he's seen
yeah,
from Deming. But
yeah,
it's a so I think we can expand the tent. I mean, if that's maybe
hmm
the way I would uh, end things. I think it's really time to do that. Look more broadly, because in the lean community, we got some unique talents as far as making the economy more productive, and productivity is desperately needed
yes,
in the economy. And let's get our talents together and make it happen.
yeah. And as people say in lean circles, yes, we want productivity. It'll be the end result of the stated differently than Deming's chain reaction, SQDC: safety, quality, delivery, cost. Productivity is
Mm-hmm.
embedded in there. I think with it's interconnected, but
Absolutely.
productivity is an end result of doing
Yeah.
all of that well.
And if you don't incorporate those into productivity, you're just fooling yourself.
Well, that's a powerful thought to to end things on. We'll leave it there. So again, joining us again on the podcast, Jacob Stoller,
Mhm.
new book available now: Productivity Reimagined: Shattering Performance Myths to Achieve Sustainable Growth. So look for links to Jacob's website, to that book. The Lean CEO is well worth checking out. My wife joined a company about 2.5 years ago as a senior leader, and her CEO recommended the book, The Lean CEO,
Oh, excellent.
among others. So the book is still getting around and helping people. So thank you for all of that, and thanks for being here, Jacob.
Well, thank you, Mark. Great to talk again.